Yes.
Um, and for everyone joining us, welcome. This is a Jefferson University Live discussing the true colors of pride. Um, and we are here with the lovely Dr. Munhazim. I would love if you can introduce yourself for all of us.
Thank you so much, Makari. My name is Ahmad Munhazim. I go by Qais. My pronouns are they, them. I'm an assistant professor of global studies at Thomas Jefferson University on the Eastfield campus. I'm a queer person from originally Afghanistan. I was born and raised in Afghanistan. I've been in the US for over a decade now, and I'm very happy to join you on this conversation on pride, both in the US but also around the world, and the celebration of pride, but also the meaning of pride, what it really means to our community.
Thank you. Thank you. We're so excited to have you here today. Um, I wanted to start off with a more general question, but what does pride mean to you personally?
Um, Before going to the meaning of pride, I also wants us to remember a lot of those queer and trans people around the world who are unable to be themselves or celebrate their lives and survivals because of wars and military occupations, whether it's in Afghanistan, in Palestine, in Somalia, Yemen, across the world in many countries where they're actually living under war, also these days Ukraine. So it's important to remind ourselves that our lives, our happiness, our communities are so connected around the world. So pride to me, as many of the leaders in our communities, including Marsha P. Johnson, has said that no pride for some of us, unless liberation for all of us. So for me, pride is liberation, celebration of freedom, celebration of survival and living and life. But at the same time, it's also a reminder that homosexuality is still criminalized, same-sex love, trans bodies are criminalized and denied access. It's also a reminder that the society has made, of course, certain strides, but we are still lacking. We are still behind in so many ways. And we're talking about people's lives, we're talking about people's joy. And pride is also about queer joy, which really gets missed in a lot of the celebrations, the meaning of pride, because we oftentimes equate queerness and transness with a lot of struggles, misery, but there's also a joy. And for me, when I see my community on the streets celebrating, protesting um, against oppressive regimes and systems, um, that itself gives me a lot of joy and pride.
Mm, thank you. That was such a beautiful answer. And this point about queer joy being so central to pride, I think, is very important. And I wanted to ask, how do you celebrate your queerness, both in this month during Pride, but also every day in both your resistance to these oppressive systems, but also in a celebration of yourself?
With my puffy sleeves. I mean, always. My queerness, I mean, my celebration of queerness has always been a very integral part of me, whether I grew up in Afghanistan in the middle of war or crossing borders in Pakistan, where I lived together with my family as a refugee. And all of that, I never, in a way, although I had no idea of my sexuality or I mean, I knew who I was, but I didn't um, had a very academic knowledge of it, or at the same time, it wasn't in this same context as it is in the US. But in so many ways, I celebrated myself in different ways. The survival that I had to make, um, living in very patriarchal border crossings, and that's anywhere. For me, I celebrate my queerness through um, every embodiment of myself, and also bringing in my own culture, the Afghan Muslim culture, which in so many ways in the Western media is juxtaposed against queerness, as if Muslims, Afghans, they're all very homophobic, but it is not. We are actually very queer in so many ways. our clothing, our language, our poetry, the way we make friendship and love. Those are all in so many ways queer. And for me, it was very much um, celebrated across my life. When I was a kid, my mom would make me these puffy sleeve clothes from the leftover fabrics that she had, because she would sew clothes for neighbors or for friends and family. And then she would join these different colorful fabrics together to create clothing for me. And in so many ways, to me, that was my mother's acceptance and love for my queerness. That she never did that for other brothers I had, but she did that for me, and she still continues to do that. Um, so whenever I'm wearing these sort of colorful and elaborate clothes, it reminds me of those times that my mother continuously reminded me of who I was and that I was still loved in so many ways.
That is very beautiful. And one thing that I'm always very impressed by you is your ability to make community wherever you are. You are multilingual, and your work really speaks to many people from different environments. So I'd love to know, how do your friends in different parts of the world celebrate their queerness? And what do you see as similar or different about queer spaces in different parts of the world?
That's a very, very important question, because we get so self-observed and self-centered when you're living in the US, that we forget that there are communities outside, that there are queerness and trans communities and celebrations and lives outside this space, that they celebrate queerness in very different ways. The very first time when we started this conversation, I um, reminded ourselves and also our listeners and audience about those queer and trans people who are basically in spaces and places that they cannot uh, be themselves, but at the same time, their lives are continuously surveilled and also living in and out violence, whether it's war, displacement, poverty. But in between all of that, the communities are still coming together, celebrating. As we were speaking in Afghanistan last year, there was a complete withdrawal of international engagement and support, and that in a way betrayed the Afghan people, and that displaced my queer and trans community in Afghanistan. They're now scattered in refugee camps around the world. Some of them are outside the refugee camps. So we are everywhere now. And that's been very, very hard 9 months. But there's still thousands and thousands of queer and trans people in Afghanistan who are struggling with uh, famine the country has been hit by, um, also violence of Taliban. So they have to go in complete hiding. Um, and they celebrate their queerness in some of the virtual spaces like Facebook, Instagram. They come and talk or dance and celebrate, but those spaces have really become places that they can actually be themselves, because outside, in places where war is, all sexualities and genders, which are not normative, but also which are not cis men, become surveilled and punished, whether they're women, queer, or trans. So, in that sense, these virtual spaces have become places of celebration, coming together, community, and survival. Uh, in other countries, you might be watching through media that, whether it's in Johannesburg, whether it's in Kathmandu or Delhi, and people are marching and in the same way during this month. But also, I think we should remind ourselves that pride shouldn't be celebrated in the same exact way or has the same exact meaning for people in other countries. Pride has a very different meaning, because in the US, it started with Stonewall in 1969, with the leadership of course, trans women of color, drag queens, lesbians, to in so many ways, to voice and stand against systematic oppression, racist and sexist and homophobic, transphobic regimes and police brutality. And so when that started, that has a history here, and in other places, pride doesn't have the same exact meaning, and we shouldn't expect that, because then it would be very Euro and Western centric to expect that people, let's say in Pakistan or in Afghanistan or in Nigeria, should be celebrating pride in the same exact way. Pride is in everyday their lives, and some of us honestly didn't even think about our sexualities because there are so many other struggles, or about our gender identity, that we had to overcome, whether it was poverty, whether it was war, displacement. And through that, many communities put their gender and sexual identities and experiences in the back burner. So all of that, those are things that become very real. My community, the queer and trans Afghans, that some of them have been displaced, this will be for some of them their first pride, marching on the streets in some places that they have actually found safety, which in so many ways it's so empowering to think about, but at the same time it's disheartening and heartbreaking knowing that they're displaced, they're away from their families and kinships, from those people who give them love unconditionally. Now they have to struggle to find themselves within these communities that, yes, there is freedom, some limited freedom of sexual and gender expressions, but then there's also racism that they have to struggle with. There's also anti-immigration policies and sentiments that they have to work their way through. So all of those then become new struggles for them in many ways.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, especially when you consider the U.S. history of pride and how it was mostly queer people of color who were fighting for their own freedom that helped initiate Pride of the United States. And I wanted to talk a little bit more of that and talk about your personal experience, about the intersections of your both queer and U.S. racial identities. How have you navigated having these multiple identities and celebrating all of them?
That's an excellent question again. Sadly, in many spaces when we are, as queer, trans, or people of color, immigrants, working class, we have to pick and choose, or which one is safer, which identity is safer, which one is accepted. And when we walk in a room, we immediately have to be so conscious of this intersectionality of our identities in ways that people treat us, in the ways that people talk to us. Which one of them I have to pick, and which of them would be much more, in a way, safe for me. As a Muslim queer person who's also from Afghanistan, I constantly get questioned whether I'm a fraud, because how could you be Afghan, Muslim, and queer? So my queerness becomes fraudulent. My Muslimness becomes fraudulent when I am in the Muslim spaces. They question me whether they actually, in a way, are in harmony. But for me, I mean, I have to fight that, but also I have to find that peace within myself. There is obviously Islamophobia within queer and trans communities. There's racism. I remember when the Orlando shooting happened in just 2016, June 12th, that was 6 years ago. I organized a march for queer and trans Muslims, but also Muslim allies, to march in the Pride Minneapolis, where I used to live and go to grad school. And that was the first time for many people seeing Muslims coming in together as against Islamophobia and also homophobia and transphobia, because we don't get that visibility. The visibility is oftentimes situated on very particular groups of people, and they are celebrated as the most progressive, civilized, and we oftentimes are, in a way, situated as transphobic, homophobic. If it wasn't for Muslim women in my life, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have survived. So I credit a lot of the things that I have learned and who I've become to Muslim and Afghan women who have continuously stood by me, supported me, and in so many ways have come in solidarity and empathy with me. So there's also continuous, of course, racism in the communities and anti-immigration. Um, I mean, stereotypes and people continuously uh, bringing that sort of hatred even within queer and trans spaces. And the one question, for example, a lot of us queer and trans, not American, get is, where are you from? The moment they hear the accent, I mean, recently I was at this gay bar in the neighborhood in Philadelphia, and I got that question. I only said one word. The person asked me where I live. I said Fairmount. That's all. And was like, what's that accent? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, what's that accent? I was like, it's an accent. And he went on, he was like, no, like, where are you from? I was like, what's your accent? He's like, what do you mean? Why are you asking me? It's American. I was like, well, why are you asking me? And that was during the Pride. And so obviously the person felt offended that I wasn't giving a straight up answer. And there's also obviously a lack of knowledge within the community that what really is problematic and what's not. It feels for many people that it's okay to ask us where are you from, and it's okay for them to immediately like put us in these very hot spots while we are just enjoying, having fun, dancing. That many people don't think about all of those, but then we have to think about immediately somebody, especially when I say Afghanistan, there's this face that people make. There's this expression that like I'm so familiar with, and it kills my mood. So that's why I don't even entertain those kind of questioning. But for all of us also, it's really hard to exist as queer and trans people of color and immigrants, black, brown, in a lot of white spaces, because we either are very exoticized or at the same time fully rejected. And we talk about that. So a lot of places that I really fully belong are, of course, those spaces that are queer, radically queer and trans, but also they are also at this intersection of brownness, blackness, refugees, Muslims, where a lot of my identities are into play, and I don't have to censor one or the other in order to fully be accepted or loved.
That is such a great point. Thank you. And this makes me think about how recently Pride has become a lot more corporatized, and with that comes this idea of respectability. Who is a face of Pride that a corporate sponsor is willing to back? And I really want to get your opinion on this about how do you feel about the corporatization of Pride? And also, how do you think that affects that community you find yourself in of queer people of color, those who stand more on the margins, but also who are the foundation of this movement?
That's an excellent question, but also an important one for all of us, queer and trans, but also allies, to think through that when we see a lot of those posts now on social media that, oh, for the month of Pride, I am in a way this person is sponsoring me, or I am actually now in sponsorship with this person, this corporations, whether it's Delta or Target or Pfizer. So all of these are in so many ways problematic, because the corporatization of Pride is really taking away what Pride was and how Pride started. It was a protest. It was a riot against police brutality. It was a protest for queer and trans lives of color. And that's what it should be. And I think that's the beauty of it this year that I saw in Philadelphia Pride, that the new leadership changed it and they turned it actually to a march, to a protest, um, not including corporates coming in with their big floats and shirtless men in like very much out of a magazine dancing and literally also sending very problematic messages to other queer and trans people that this is how you need to look like. You need to have sex packs. You need to, and a lot of them are also, you would see there's this straight white men, which is nothing wrong with them being part of the community, but the centrality of that on them makes many people excluded, including women, trans, non-binary folks, people of color, people with disabilities, the elderly. Um, and the corporatization of it has started um, over the past decades in the way that during this month, all these corporations are even changing their logos with the flag and then um, highlighting one or two uh, employees that they have, putting them on the spot to talk about their experiences, tokenizing them in so many ways. Um, but then immediately, 11 months during the year, completely ignoring them or not actually listening to them. Pride is not about that. It's not about celebrating this community, taking advantage of them for a month, and then forgetting about them for the rest of the year. Um, and that's very much something that a lot of queer and trans people are coming to realize, and hopefully that they would actually, in a way, take a step back, that Pride is not brought to you by Absolute Vodka. Cool, drink it if it's free, or by Target bags or a few swags that corporations throw at us. It was brought by trans women of color, by drag queens, by lesbians, by Black women, and that's what we all need to celebrate, and that history, and we need to, um, in a way, not allow this corporate word to take over, because it is these corporations that have in so many ways funded homophobic, transphobic policies in this country and in many other countries. If they are pouring a few flags on us, dropping a few vodka on us, that doesn't mean that they're not also pouring the same amount or more money into politicians who are anti-trans healthcare. For example, in UK, earlier the question was how people are celebrating Pride around the world. Trans women in UK, across UK, have to wait for years in line to just get access to hormone therapy. Within that, some of them take their lives. And those are realities that people live in other countries. People even don't have that privilege to be on a line for, or think about, or dream about. And these corporations, in so many ways, are involved in it. Today, when we think about queer pride, it's also very important to think about those queer and trans people who died during the AIDS, what they call it, crisis and or endemic. It wasn't a crisis; it was made into a crisis because the states refused to help and provide healthcare for queer and for mainly gay men who died of AIDS during that time. So it's important to think that these corporations weren't there then. They could have been. They had the money, they had the power to support, but they refused to do that. So it's important to remind ourselves that corporations are not there for our liberation. They're always there to exploit us. They're always there to profit from that opportunity.
Very true, very true. And I think kind of as we look at Pride moving forward, I would like to use radical imagination. And I would love if you could share your own brilliance on this of how you think we can better, let's the word, how we can better represent the history of what pride is within our celebration and within our political action, moving forward from this point to make pride something that celebrates who it was meant to celebrate.
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, because I plugged in my phone to charge because
Oh.
my phone is always dead. I think a lot of queer people phone is always dead because there's so many activities on the phones, like we live in our phones. So um, yes, that's a beautiful way to like move away from this corporate violence into queer and trans dreaming and futures. Um, it's very important for us to turn pride into queer and trans futures and the beautiful creation of dreams for our liberation. When we think about um, communities coming together, um, one thing that I really love about this month, despite the fact that it has been taken over in so many ways by corporations, that I'm highly critical on the way that we also celebrate um, being out and coming out, but not also celebrating those who might not be out, but they're queer. They are quote unquote in closet. So what? That should be also in the same way celebrated. If somebody chooses not to come out, this shouldn't be forced upon them. We need to celebrate those multi complexities of queerness that in so many ways we are some days out, some days not out, or in some spaces we are out, in some spaces we are not, or maybe we decide not to ever come out. Um, and those are the ways that I want to dream about a radical queer and trans world where people are not pushed into these binaries and binary pathways that you have to be in this particular way in order to be fully accepted as queer and trans and fully celebrated. We shouldn't be shaming people who are in the closet. We need to move away from that. We shouldn't be shaming queer and trans people who are hyper or sexually active because that is also part of our queerness. Um, the kings and the leather and a lot of spaces that has received so much criticism in the past years that pride has to now like tone down, make it more family oriented. It's problematic because all of those are part of the community. We cannot just like say, you know what, let's now straight wash and cis wash pride and make it much more accessible and for the heterosexual heteronormative gaze. I think that's what I'm dreaming about, a future where we are actually celebrating the messiness of queerness. We are celebrating this diversity of sexual and gender orientations and practices that we bring in and performances, because gender itself is also a performance. Um, that we are not continuously surveilled, that we have to tone ourselves down because they're families in this space, or because we have to be in a certain way to be fully accepted by, especially like when we think about the institution of marriage, right? Same-sex marriage is celebrated in so many ways. Good for those who celebrate it or get or has or who have the privilege to get married. But it shouldn't be seen as the only liberation, because again, the institution of marriage is a very heteronormative institution, and it has always been. So by bringing in this, states around the world are uh, allowing or legalizing same-sex marriage, and with that, then at the same time oppressing healthcare for trans people, and at the same time they are closing borders for refugees. All of those needs to be seen collectively and in the same way, that that's not a progress. because states are actually forcing queer and trans people to become the heteronormative couple that in a way becomes part of the state register and signs a contract into marriage. um, I think that's what I want to dream about, a queer world that in a way gets rid of all of those, and we are ready to celebrate this very radical ways of being queer and being trans, but at the same time um, fighting against racist structures and systems, fighting for trans women of color, fighting for those with disabilities. Because when you go to Pride, a lot of Prides are not made accessible because they don't put any efforts. It's assumed that like everybody is having the same sort of abilities. Or for the elderly, it's heartbreaking. I don't know if any of the viewers have been to Philadelphia gay bars. They're very segregated in terms of even age group. There are a couple of them that are the U Bar and Knock that are very much elderly. And it becomes so isolating and lonely because they don't feel safe or accepted or fully loved and respected in the other bars. And so the catering of like different bars for different age groups then becomes ageist. And that's not a queer uh, future I want to dream for myself, because we all get old. We all want to be loved. We all want to have spaces to go and celebrate ourselves or live or enjoy. We don't want to be, in a way, molded and pushed into certain spaces because the other spaces we are not seen, or we're not welcome. But at the same time, I want us to dream about a future that is freedom for queer and trans and all people in across different places and worlds that are living under wars, and that's where my dream is oftentimes take me, because people ask me all the time that you wouldn't have been who you are now if you weren't in the U.S. But then I switch that question. I say, if it wasn't for all these wars, you don't know what I would have become. In so many ways, it limited me. It displaced me from my home. And that has done that to so many other queer and trans people, that they have been completely displaced from their homes, and then they have to then become somebody else to be fully accepted.
That is such a great point. And something you said really caught my eye, where you said, I want to make space for the most radical versions of queerness. And I wanted to touch on that in terms of your relationship with identity labels. I think labels have become something that's very contentious, because for some, they can be very liberatory in finding identities that they are late to but did not even have the words to describe. And for some, they can feel confining in that they may not feel their version of radical queerness fits any label. And so they feel as if they don't know where to find their community. And this obviously has many implications for people of different cultures or those with disability. And I really wanted to hear your perspective on that.
It's a great question again. So I take you back to my native language, Farsi, Dari, is gender neutral. So it doesn't have any genders. When we speak about pronouns, for example, we just say O, which refers to a person regardless of their gender identity. And I found that so beautiful, because I was always able to write poetry, to write prose about my desires, about my crushes, about my love, without people knowing who I was writing for. And they were read on public radios, or published, but people always assumed that it was for the opposite gender because I was using that pronoun, because there's no way to give away. So I found so much shelter and safety in there until, like, of course, I moved, and then I had here, and then I had to navigate my life around English, which is so gendered in so many ways, but then also taken on these labels of queer, gay, lesbian, that they become so limiting in so many ways that we are then expected to, in a way, live up to those labels. So labels are in so many ways, yes, it is good. I'm all for it when people take those labels on and in a way it speaks to them. I respect all of that, but at the same time, we need to respect all of those other people who find these labels limiting, who find these labels as traps. But also, like, even putting all these categories together, LGBTQIA plus, it's assumed that they all have the same exact issues. No, trans people have always had a lot more struggles than cis gay men, for example. And at particular different times during AIDS pandemic, men of color, men in general, gay men and trans women had also a lot of struggles in different ways and being discriminated. But also the asexual community are completely ignored in this when we put them all in these labels. Bisexual communities are completely ignored. Um, and in other societies, honestly, these labels don't even exist. It's who you are. For example, in Afghanistan, where I grew up, there was no labels around your sexuality that you have to take on, and it was accepted fully that okay, this is like who you are, but also it was not talked about. Who you're in love with, it becomes very private part of you. But of course now the new generation, they have come up with the word morat, which refers to the embodiment of the man and woman and the in-betweens and the um, all spectrum around gender and sexuality, which the term umbrella term that like is used or the garboshan for all different communities with different gender identities and sexual identities. Um, but again, some people would be much uh, careful or cautious to use these labels because the label sometimes also exposes people to more violence. So when you identify as a certain queer, you become much more visible. You become much more exposed. And let's not forget that we are still living in very homophobic, transphobic societies, that people are still forced not to even say the word gay, or healthcare systems are not set up to include us. So when we take on these labels, we also expose ourselves to much more visibility, and that comes with also in violence. Um, so I think um, it's okay for people not to take on these labels. It's okay for them to take on these labels. It's how they connect with their own self and their own journeys and their own experiences. It's not for us to tell somebody who they should be or who they are. What I really, I remember coming to the US, what really bothered me the most was that when people immediately asked me if I was gay, the moment I would talk or the moment they would see me, and I didn't have any reference to that label growing up. That word existed in somewhere in my knowledge about other people, not about myself. So I would get really uncomfortable when people would ask me that because I didn't want to. I didn't have come to like a harmony and peace with that term and label because it was in English. It didn't really speak to my experiences. But at the same time, I didn't want people to immediately put a label on me and refer to me this one particular thing because we are beyond that. We are more than that. And we shouldn't be assuming that a lesbian, gay, trans, and queer person are just that. They are much more than that one identity or experience they have.
Very much. Thank you. And I have one last question for you. In relation to the fact that this being held at Jefferson University, there's obviously going to be a lot of young people seeing this and coming to become being comfortable with your queerness can be a journey in a country that is not always welcoming to different identities and different expressions of queerness. And so I'd love to hear what you have to say to those who may be watching this, who are still trying to find that comfortability to be prideful about their queerness. And you, as somebody who is so inspirational and so brilliant in the way you speak, would love to hear what you have to say to those people.
Thank you for your love, Makari. I have been learning so much from you from just a few interactions we had, and I think your generation, the young generation, are my hope, honestly, because you all have made these spaces so much trans, non-binary, queer friendly for all of us, and for also this new generation. I really enjoy teaching because when I started my own journey as an undergrad and even grad school, I found it quite transphobic and homophobic, um, and it was a struggle to even speak about my experiences, to even speak about my journey, about my identity. But that was also, I was living in the Midwest. I mean, East Coast is a very different place for that. But at the same time, this, I remember exactly, it was like a decade ago that I would always find myself as the only person who was queer in the classroom, or who would oftentimes get very homophobic comments um, from people. But that also made me think quite often, how would that translate into me being a professor one day? Would I be very comfortable teaching? What if my students don't accept me? Um, and honestly, the journey the past 3 years has been very enriching and very freeing for me in so many ways. Just knowing that there's so much acceptance among this new generation. They are constantly rapturing and changing these identities in so many ways. I'm learning so much from them. And so I walk in the classroom first day of class, I don't censor myself. This is who I am. You can see my queerness in my clothing, in my performances, in my uh, talk, and I openly share about my own experiences so that people also talk about that, because some people would want to have a queer and trans or non-binary professor to look up to or to learn from or also become their mentor. And we need that sense of community. It was for those people in my own life where I actually survived. If it wasn't for those people who give me that sort of love and care, I wouldn't have been here. Um, and coming out of Afghanistan, going through these different borders, getting my PhD, and becoming a professor. All of those layers had a lot of these people who radically lived their beautiful self, that inspired me, but also they helped me uh, bring all of me into the classroom. My students are often, I mean, some amazing, amazing, beautiful people who really constantly um, talk about these issues, but at the same time, even if they're not queer and trans themselves, they're allies. They're radical allies who are very self aware of not using homophobic, transphobic language or not tokenizing the one or two uh, trans or queer friends that they have. And so we talk about those in different ways and order the intersectionality of these experiences and identities that are so important. I get oftentimes asked that, oh, like all of your classes, you always talk about gender and sexuality, but I'm like, we need to talk more about this because these are very important factors in our lives. These are things that every aspect of our lives is gendered and sexed, whether it's food, whether it's classroom, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's politics. And that's how we bring that into classroom. So the new generation, your generation is often is the dream that we always had for a generation who's going to be changing the world and moving us towards a much more radically queer and trans world. And I see that. And those gives me hopes for the future.
Thank you so much. And thank you for taking the time out to do
Of
this
course.
and to share your wisdom. Always appreciate it.
Of course.
But
I
that
love
is,
being here talking to you.
yes, yes. And that is all the questions I have for today. But we will be posting this live on the Nexus page. And again, I'm always appreciative of the words you speak, and we will definitely be reaching out to hear more from you soon.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for creating this space at Jefferson, but also with the community, because we need much more of these spaces and these conversations. Because we, during this month, despite the fact that it is a Pride Month celebration, uh, many people also feel isolated because oftentimes the focus becomes these celebrations of cooperation, celebrations of spaces outside that becomes very limiting for those who are back with their families. That these families could be homophobic, transphobic. Summers are quite hard, especially for queer and trans students going back with their families, and and in a way disconnecting with their friend circle and with the communities. Um, and so it's important to have these conversations, and especially the pandemic has really even tripled those struggles, especially for queer and trans people of color that live at the intersection of all of those marginalizations and oppressions. So I'm here to support that, and for anyone who is struggling with that, that we are here to fully support you and celebrate you. And it's always my um, emails are always open for students to reach out and to discuss and talk about these journeys, and in whatever way I can be of help and support. Um, because as much as we think about June as this month of celebration and pride, it also could be a month of struggle for those who are still trying to figure out who they are. So it's important to remind them that it's okay. We all have been there. We are still, some days we are struggling with other parts of our life, and I still like oftentimes have to like think twice in some spaces the way that I carry myself, and so it takes time. It takes also a community to come and support us. So hopefully that we can create this sort of spaces and communities more, and give visibility to queer and trans voice to queer and trans people throughout the year, not just only in June, because not all queer and trans people were born in June to celebrate them. I mean, let's celebrate them around the clock and throughout the year.
You're so right. And thank you for being a leader and
Of course.
creating that space for students, but also just in general in the Philadelphia community.
Thank
You
you.
will always be a pillar here. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for leading this conversation and this whole process. It's been a joy talking to you and with you, and lots of love and happy Pride Mubarak to all those who are celebrating this month. And hopefully that I'll get to see some of you in person in the classroom if you're my students.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Talk soon.
Bye.